The time is upon us, where the previous season for the new Death Guard Codex is finally coming to an end, and we are getting a real good look at what this codex does on the tabletops of Warhammer 40k. It's a scary time, and potentially the herald of the new -1 damage metagame that everyone has been worried about since Heavy Bolters got an additional point of damage on their profile. So let's start talking about the rules previews we have so far for the 9th edition Death Guard Codex. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, and today we're going to be talking about Death Guard. Now, instead of doing a normal sort of preview review, I think I'm going to split this one up and talk about each portion individually in a separate video. That way we can keep it a little bit more compartmentalized, and I'm not just scrolling through sort of endless pages of blurry pictures all at once in one big long video, and we can break it up a little bit more. So today we're going to be talking about some of the most important things that you get in any codex. And those are the stratagems coming in out of the new Death Guard Codex. Now, I think people have started to play games with preview versions of the Codex. I don't have 100% of all the rules, and if by the time you watch this video, that stuff is known. You can feel free to laugh at me in the comment section. Go down there, leave me a comment about how stupid I was to not know 100% of the rules. And then also like and subscribe to the video. You know, all that YouTube stuff. You know the drill. So first off, the big changes, obviously, are to the disgustingly resilient rule, which previously gave all Death Guard models a 5+ damage ignore roll. Now it just gives them a damage reduction of 1. 2 damage weapons become 1. 3 damage weapons become 2. All that stuff. Now, clearly, the rule is not quite as good as a 5+ damage ignore across your entire army, but in conjunction with 2 wound, basic infantry, it can help you against a lot of mid-weight weapons like heavy bolters or D3 damage weapons like battle cannons. That's going to be really good, even into your little 2 wounds Plague Marines. On the big vehicles, it basically only affects 2 damage weapons for the most part. It ends up mathematically significantly worse than a 5+ damage ignore, but it is still a really good rule. As we've been finding out playing against the billion dreadnoughts everywhere, it's pretty solid. We also got some new abilities up in this codex. Diseased minions limits the number of poxwalkers you can bring into your army. The rules designers have gone very much out of their way to limit the effectiveness of some SKU lists that we saw be very effective out of Death Guard in the past, especially in 8th edition. We even have a couple Space Marine Captain restriction style rules for Lords of the Death Guard, as well as Demon Princes, where you can only include 1 for each detachment, limiting the amount of Hero Hammer you can sort of play around with in this codex. I definitely think that we're going to be seeing a lot of these style rules in codexes to come. I don't know if I really like them. I would much rather lists like that be limited just mechanically rather than, you know, having to kind of cobble together a rule to force you to stop playing them. But in terms of Games Workshop's design, their army selection is usually so wide that something gets eventually broken, and limiting the amount that you can spam it if they do find something that's really good makes a ton of sense. Now, we've already seen previews for the Inexorable Advance rule as well. This is a good one. Count yours remaining stationary as long as you didn't advance or fall back, which is awesome. Means you fire your heavy weapons for free. You're basically an Ultramarine all the time, essentially. Shoot your heavy weapons for free. Shoot your rapid-fire weapons at maximum range with hateful volleys. And it allows vehicles to shoot into melee for free as well, and infantry to ignore penalties to their movement characteristic. Interesting, because there are some movement characteristic penalties in this codex, so the Death Guard mirror match is going to be hilarious. These are used in conjunction with the other army-wide abilities. Plague weapons give you reroll 1s all the time. Remorseless just gives you and they shall know no fear, except with a different name. And as we talked about before, disgustingly resilient reduces damage against you by 1 to a minimum of 1. Now, in this video, I want to cover stratagems specifically because stratagems is usually, like I said before, a very important part of any codex. It sort of determines the combos and the overall faction identity of that faction, and it takes a long time to go through, so I figure I'd dedicate a whole video to it. Now, the most interesting thing about these Death Guard stratagems, I think, is what they herald for Chaos Space Marine stratagems coming in any future releases. We can see already we may have a change to Veterans of the Long War, Eternal Hatred. Now, similar to Veterans of the Long War, this targets infantry specifically. Veterans of the Long War could also be used on bikers. So if this is a change that we see in a future Chaos Space Marine Codex, I think the combos where you take a bunch of Slaneshi bikers and with 4 bolters on each of them, and then you double tap them and you shoot 1,000 times with +1 to wound, those are probably going by the wayside. I mean, I also imagine Endless Cacophony is going to go the way of the dodo as well, but we'll see. The big change here, though, is that this ability has been upgraded to 2 CP instead of 1. For 1 CP, you'd throw Veterans of the Long War down like it was candy. You'd start a game with 10 CP, and that would just be basically 10 activations of Veterans of the Long War, because that ability is so incredible. It makes a ton of sense that Games Workshop would try to tone down this, the level of power of the +1 to wound strat like that. So 2 CP makes a ton of sense to me. In previous iterations, Death Guard has never really been a sub-faction that makes a great use of veterans. It's really good, and especially when you get like one of those big Plague Fell squads into your opponent, dropping that 1 CP for +1 to wound is really sweet. But outside a couple instances where you're like blight bombardmenting people with a bunch of grenades with the mortal wounds and all that stuff, they never really leaned into the combo attacks that this normal Chaos Space Marine sub-faction did. There are going to be a couple ways to combo some stratagems together to do some real damage. One of them is Trench Fighters, which will give you +1 attack if you are equipped with Plague Knives. Plague Knives are basically a standard close combat weapon that a lot of Plague Marines can have that is just a strength user AP0 plague weapon for 1 damage. So it just gives you reroll 1s to wound. Previously, if you had 2 of them, you would automatically get +1 attack. I don't know if that's staying around. If it is, that's awesome, and it does look like the wording of the stratagem makes it seem like that they're gonna still give an additional attack, since you make an additional attack with 1 of your Plague Knives, so it looks like the option to take 2 will still be in the Plague Marine unit, which would be good. So potentially for 1 CP, you can make a whole boatload of little stabby knife attacks out of a unit of Plague Marines. You can also combo that on top of it with Creeping Blight, which gives you just rending on your Plague weapons, just like Plague Knives. So unmodified wound rolls of 6 are AP4 instead of their standard AP value. If you are throwing, like, I don't know, 40 attacks out of a Plague Marine unit, that's going to make a lot of sense. You could potentially Arch Contaminated that to full reroll your wound rolls, and that's going to be a lot of activations of -4 AP, so I actually think that stratagem is going to be pretty good. We see a potential update to the Fire Frenzy stratagem. The Fire Fever stratagem, a little bit different. Now targets a Death Guard Hellbrute model from your army. You can only target a single enemy unit, and you get +1 to hit and +1 to wound instead of being able to fire twice. Interestingly, this doesn't target the nearest enemy unit, so it is a little bit more flexible than the old version where you shot twice, but I liked shooting, a bunch of missile launchers 2 times. Now, it does look like the previous sort of non-interaction that occurred between a lot of the Forge World Dreadnoughts and these Hellbrute stratagems has been removed. It used to be that the Hellbrute stratagem specifically targeted a Hellbrute datasheet, even though a lot of other things had the Hellbrute keyword, although they were different somehow. There was a lot of confusion where it looked like you could double shoot your Leviathan Dreadnoughts, when in fact you couldn't. That's been removed since a lot of that Forge World stuff has lost the Hellbrute keyword. That's sort of a non sequitur to the stratagem, but I don't know. I thought it was an interesting little tidbit. Vermid Whispers is a Fury of the First style stratagem that gives you +1 to hit with your Death Guard Terminator units. These stratagems are always awesome, especially with how elite your Terminators are going to be, and you really want to get the most of your attacks, so I don't know, seems good to me. Haze of Corruption is a 2 CP stratagem that gives your core units in the fight phase the flail rule. Now, I don't know if this means that the Plague Flails will no longer have this rule, where excess damage carries over to subsequent models. If it doesn't, that's too bad, but I wouldn't be that surprising, because it is super duper powerful and also kind of confusing. But 2 CP is a lot for that stratagem, especially when I think in the current metagame we're going to be swinging into 2 or 3 wood models very often, so I don't know how useful it's going to be. But if you are going up against hordes, it does give you a little bit of an out, where you can cleave through a bunch of dudes with some pretty efficient attacks. There are a couple stratagems that synergize specifically with Poxwalkers. It looks like despite the fact that Poxwalkers have been kind of reduced in their effectiveness just by the fact that you can't take as many of them in an army, they are trying to make them work, and I don't know, these stratagems for Poxwalkers seem pretty good. One of them in the fight phase. One of them, the Mutant Strain stratagem, deals mortal wounds on hit rolls of 6 or 1, but to whom do they deal the damage? On 6s, you deal mortal wounds to your opponent. On 1s, you deal mortal wounds to yourself. They're Poxwalkers, so you don't really care that much about them. But also dealing mortal wounds on a hit roll. Remember, this isn't an unmodified wound roll. It's not a sniper roll. It's hit rolls, which means it's going to be very effective since, I mean, the Poxwalkers aren't very good at hitting to begin with. I think they're only weapon skill 4. But they do break a pretty reasonable number of attacks, making 2 swings apiece. So just for 1 CP, being able to throw mortal wounds out on people, especially with mortal wounds being so important right now in the metagame, this seems pretty good. Diseased Effluence is another stratagem that's actually seems also incredibly good. Dealing mortal wounds is weird in weird ways. Seems like it's mostly going to be the Death Guard shtick. I mean, it already was. Like, they had a bunch of weird, bizarre ways to deal mortal wounds with, like, odd psychic powers and auras and stuff like that, and this is one of them. This is a stratagem used in your command phase, assuming one of your characters is already engaged by an enemy. So that means you're stuck in a prolonged combat, your opponent charged you and you didn't die, or in their fight phase you piled into them. A situation like that, it's only 1 CP, and when you do, you automatically deal a mortal wound to them, so you are spending 1 CP for a mortal wound. That's not a great trade, but it is okay. However, then you roll, and on a 2+, they take 2 D3 additional mortal wounds, or just a regular D3 if they are a non-vehicle character. So that is, if you're hitting an infantry unit, an average of 5 mortal wounds for 1 CP. Holy crap. That's insane, and really incentivizes you, in conjunction with some other abilities, to play very aggressively with your Death Guard characters. Not to mention the fact that Death Guard armies, a lot like a lot of Space Marine armies, tend to have a lot of little weird characters sort of crammed in crevices and stuff. Like, you got your Foul Blightspawn, you got your Biologus Putrefiers, you got your whatever the psychic guy's called. And a lot of these Death Guard armies have a lot of these very specialist characters all over the place. So, you know, random heroic interventions in your opponent's charge phase to get them into combat, random pile-ins to get them everywhere, means that you're going to have a lot of situations randomly where you're going to be able to trigger this stratagem, and I think almost every time it is worth it. Even on most 4-ish wound characters, there's a non-zero chance you just kill them if you pile into like a guardsman or a mini-marine character like a lieutenant or an apothecary. If you roll a 5+ in those D3 mortal wounds, they just die. There's for 1 CP. That's incredible. This stratagem is amazing. Wow. Moving on, we also have a operated top profile for machine spirit vehicles. I think it's going to be interesting that a lot of the Chaos Space Marine vehicles are going to get the machine spirit keyword. Perfect. I'm very excited for that. That just means your land raiders and stuff might operate slightly more efficiently if you are taking them for some reason. I don't know, maybe they're good. Who knows? Befouled Incubators for 1 CP deals mortal wounds to a unit on a 3+ after one of those units is dead. However, you can only deal a maximum of 3 mortal wounds with the stratagem. I mean, that's fine. I think 1 CP for 3 mortal wounds in a lot of situations when you need it is going to be very good, especially if you're trying to chew through big hordes. Being able to just kill another 3 models almost automatically for 1 CP is pretty good. If we're looking at stuff like, I don't know, like I played against Rax the other day, and their toughness 5 with a 4+ invulnerable save. Killing them sucks. So if you could just spend 1 CP and knock 3 of them out of the unit automatically, I'm in. Do it. It sounds good. Release of Toxins is another interesting way to deal mortal wounds and stuff, although I think a little bit more situational. It's 2 CP, used in your command phase, and if you have a Death Guard character with a relic, they explode out in a 7-inch aura. You roll for each enemy unit in that aura. On 2+, they take a mortal wound. On a 6, they take D3, and you can only use it on each relic character once per game. I don't know. A big aura of mortal wounds is pretty good, but typically spreading mortal wounds across your opponent's army is not very effective. And especially since it's a not super big aura off of a character model, so it's not going to be enormous. It's also 2 CP. Like, for 1 CP, I could definitely see use cases for this, but unless you really need those mortal wounds, you know, you're playing against Custodes and you really want to try to kill them as quickly as you can, I don't know if I would really ever use this one. Eruption of Filth, though, I love this one. This is a 1 CP stratagem that auto-explodes, wait for it, not your vehicles, but your characters. Use it when a character model is destroyed instead of any of the other abilities to trigger when they're destroyed. You roll a d6 for everything within 3, and basically the same thing as Release of Toxins. Deal a mortal wound, 2+, and you deal D3 mortal wounds out of 6. Obviously not a ton of mortal wounds, but only 1 CP for this one, and it's a little bit of a way to get your characters to deal additional damage, especially since your characters have probably already synced in a bunch of damage to your opponent's army. If you can go into a character, you leave them on 1, they kill you, you just kill them back with this, awesome, we're doing it. I think that's really the use case that we want for Eruption of Filth. I think you're going to use that one a lot more than Release the Toxins, let me tell you. Move over to the Requisition Stratagems. We have a special issue War Gear stratagem that gives a champion one of this very specific relics. We'll talk about relics in another video, but those being the Reaper of Glorious Entropy, which is a pretty sweet, like, Thunderhammer equivalent weapon, I think I like. The Plague Skull of Glolthela, the Plague Bringer, or the Suppurating Plate, which unfortunately got a huge nerf, but can get your champions to a 2+ armor save, which I think has the potential to be interesting in some builds. Gifts of Decay is the stratagem to give additional things relics for 1 CP, very good. Plague Chosen is the stratagem to give additional things warlord traits, also very good. I'm excited that factions other than Space Marines are getting these. I'm sort of sad that we have to wait for new codexes for all the factions to get these, because I think there are a lot of combos that other factions would like to use with them. But, you know, it's okay. Last but not least, for grandfatherly influence, we have a 1 or 2 CP stratagem to buff Chaos Spawn in your army. I don't know if Chaos Spawn are going to be getting a new data sheet. I think they would have to be for this to be good. You get +1 toughness. You also get Disgusting and Resilient for -1 to be damaged. If it's a 3 model unit, it costs 1 CP. Otherwise, it costs 2. I don't know. Have Spawn ever been good? Maybe they're good now, and you're gonna take them. I don't know. Well, I have to see if they get a new data sheet. We'll see. Sickly Corrosion is an interesting stratagem. It is 2 CP, so relatively pricey, but as soon as you hit something with a plague weapon, so if you have a plague weapon gun, for example, you then reroll all of your wounds against that same unit. So if you have your little Foul Blightspawn run up there, he shoots it with its flamethrower, ba-boo! Get some automatic hits going, drop 2 CP on it, everything rerolls ones. We also have some additional combos with ranged attacks in this faction that you can stack on top of that, and you get reroll ones against them. It seems okay. Especially with how effective these Death Guard's sort of small arms fire is going to be, because they're all Ultramarines and they can all like double tap their rapid fire weapons at long range. Belching Fumes is a stratagem that is a full 1 edition too late. Unfortunately, it gives your Mephitic Blight Haulers a very interesting ability. It gives your opponents during the shooting phase -1 attacks against them. The downside of the stratagem is that you use it at the start of the shooting phase, and it costs 2 CP if you have a 3 model unit of Blight Haulers. So, unfortunately, you have to set up a situation where your opponent wants to attack the Blight Haulers and can't really attack anything else for the stratagem to be worthwhile. And assuming that you have a 3 model unit of Blight Haulers, which a lot of times you're trying to get to, it is going to be relatively expensive for something that can be ignored. That said, you can combo it with something like this other stratagem that's on the same page, Cloud of Flies, to put the Blight Haulers directly in your opponent's face, force them to attack them by shielding the other important stuff behind them with Cloud of Flies, then also Belching Fumes to make them much more difficult to deal with. However, if your opponent has a bunch of stuff that only shoots one attack, this stratagem only reduces their attacks to a minimum of 1. So, for example, if they shoot a heavy bolter, it goes from 3 shots down to 2, which is okay. But if they shoot a las cannon, it's still 1 shot. I guess this is kind of a silver bullet to multi-meltas. Like, get stuffed multi-meltas. It's just a 50% damage reduction against them, which is really nice. And multi-melta style weapons are definitely what people are going to be packing to kill Mephitic Blight Haulers now with the universal damage reduction. So, in those situations, I guess it's pretty good. But man, I don't know if Blight Haulers are going to see play anymore. They're so expensive now. Blight Bombardment is an orbital strike style stratagem, or orbital bombardment style stratagem. You pick anywhere on the table in the start of your command phase. Then on your next command phase, you hit it with a little Blight Bomb. Boo! You roll a die for everything within 6 inches of the point that you picked. On a 2+, they take D3 mortal wounds. And then on a 7, it hits D6 mortal wounds. It hits infantry a little bit harder by adding +1 to the roll, which allows you to get to that 7 to deal D6 mortal wounds. And on characters, you get -1, so there's a greater chance that you miss a character with it. For only 2 CP, if you have a Lord of Virulence in your army, I mean, this seems like a pretty playable stratagem, especially since it's hitting for D3 mortal wounds pretty consistently. That's a number of wounds that you kind of want to spread out, and just dropping it in your opponent's castle if they're trying to hide artillery out of line of sight or something, and being able to spread a bunch of D3 mortal wounds across their army is pretty good. I also love these kind of stratagems because there's a lot of counterplay to them. Like, your opponent could just move away from the marker, but if they do, a lot of times they'll be moving into cover or off objective markers, and I think that's a really interesting give and take. I kind of like Blight Bombardment. I would pay 2 CP for that. 3 CP I think is a little much, but 2 CP I would definitely give it a go. Now, interestingly, according to the wording of the ability, it looks to me like these mortal wounds will automatically be triggered on infantry units, since obviously it's a modified dice roll, and it's impossible to roll less than a 2 if you're rolling 1d6 plus 1 against an infantry unit. That's also not exclusive with the character clause, so it will trigger on infantry characters on a 2+. Any non-infantry character will get hit on a 3. I'm not 100% sure if that's in the way that the stratagem is intended to be used, and to make things a little bit more variant and not have them trigger automatically on stuff, but I kind of like that it does actually automatically deal mortal wounds, and for that reason, I actually think Blight Bombardment is going to see a lot of play in a lot of games, especially if you can get it down for 2 CP. The Dead Man Walk, again, is a Poxwalker-specific stratagem. You pick a Poxwalker unit in your command phase, you roll 7 dice, the meme number, we're getting memey up in here, and on a 3+, you get a Poxwalker back into the unit. Awesome. That seems good, especially since Poxwalkers are troops and ostensibly objective-secured infantry. They have the same restrictions as reanimation protocol, so that you can only put them in engagement range of enemy units that are already engaging the Poxwalker unit, but you can chain them out by chaining your coherency out a little bit to grab objectives, to contest opponents' objectives, to get some extra threat range. I think if you're taking Poxwalkers, this stratagem is going to be sort of core of what your army's trying to do. So, I mean, we already talked about a sweet Poxwalker stratagem that kills them. You can then just regenerate them with this strat. I think that's pretty cool. Cloud of Eyes, we just touched on. It works almost identically to how it worked previously. There are a couple other situations where it turns off, however. If you have the Bodyguard ability, which I assume the Death Shroud Terminators are going to be getting in this new codex, which makes characters untargetable within 3 inches of them. It turns off if they are targeted with Cloud of Flies, so you cannot make a character untargetable, then also make the unit making them untargetable. I'm glad that that interaction has been solved. GW, they're playtesters, they don't catch everything, but sometimes they get these abilities right, and I'm very proud of them. But Cloud of Flies, just like it did previously, makes a unit untargetable by ranged attacks at the start of your opponent's shooting phase, as long as there is another eligible target. However, you can also now target that unit if you are just within 12 inches of them, and if you target a Terminator with it, it costs 4 CP rather than 2. So if you're trying to make your Terminators unshootable, it's a little bit tough. That said, you're usually bringing Terminators, so like they're the tankiest models in your army, so if you're not using their tankiness, I don't know if it matters that much, although keeping them alive by flooding Poxwalkers up the table or something sounds pretty good, which you can then regenerate with Deadwalk again. I don't know, it's a combo. It is an expensive combo, though. Cloud of Flies has always been a staple of Death Guard armies, and really important in an edition where grabbing objectives for a full battle round is very important. This is going to be a big deal for the Death Guard armies in the future. Games Workshop has had a long and storied history of making leadership-affecting stratagems that are bad, and maybe that age is over now with Break Their Spirits, a stratagem that reduces your opponent's leadership by not 1, by not 2. It does not subtract 1 from their combat attrition tests or their leadership value. It reduces their leadership by 4. 4 points! That's so much! The downside is that, I mean, it is a stratagem, and you have to use it in the fight phase after a Terminator model from your army kills an infantry, beast, or swarm with a melee attack. Less useful than I think we'd like. The first time I read this through, I missed that it was used in the fight phase, and I thought you could have a Terminator unit just like Combi Bolter, 1 model out of every one of your opponent's units, and then drop their entire leadership by 4, and I was like, this is amazing! You're gonna kill so much stuff with combat attrition. Nah, that's not how it works. You have to punch them, physically hit them with your fist. That means it's not gonna be quite as useful, although there are some really funny combos that we noticed later on in the codex, where you can turn off enemy aura abilities, where a lot of leadership buffs happen. For example, as a Tyranid player myself, Synapse is an aura ability currently, and a Synapse creature is fearless because they are affected by their own Synapse aura. So if you make them untargetable by their own aura, then reduce their leadership by 4, you can make Tyranid warriors run away. Hilarious. I think that's funny. I don't know how often this is going to be useful, but the times that it is are going to be pretty cool. Again, Death Guard have a lot of interesting tools to go into horde lists, and one of them could be just like jamming 10 Terminators in the center of the board, punching 3 models out of every one of their opponent's units, and then affecting them all with -4 leadership and enforcing combat attrition on all of them. I mean, very Death Guard-y, honestly. Now, last but not least, for the stratagems that we're going to talk about in this video, Dark Cravings allows your fetid blight drones to heroically intervene 6 inches. 6-inch heroic intervention stratagems have always been good and will always be good forever and ever. So that'll be sick. It really just depends on how efficient the fetid blight drone is and if you already are trying to include it in your army. It looks like their melee weapon got a really big buff in one of the recent previews, so hopefully we do see them on the table. And this will make them very difficult to steal objectives from, since, especially if you're coming in with like small objective secured units, they could just put those flesh mowers to work and start buzzsawing your entire army to death. Now, this isn't all of the stratagems in the codex. Each of the individual plague hosts also gives you access to a plague host specific stratagem. I don't know all of those right now, so I'll talk about them in a later video once they get revealed. I'm sure that they're going to be awesome. But until then, thanks for watching, everybody. I hope you enjoyed. Next video, I'll be talking about the pregame selections, warlord traits, relics, their special issues stuff. So stay tuned for that video, and as always, keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.